This episode of Novara FM is brought to you by listeners like you. Here at Novara Media, we are people powered, and we've proven it works. Without you, these podcasts wouldn't be possible. If you are one of the thousands of regular Novara FM listeners who are yet to support us, please consider donating 1 hour's wage per month, or whatever you can afford, and help us make an even bigger impact next year. Go to novaramedia.com/support. We really couldn't do any of this without you, so thank you. With the re-election of Donald Trump, cryptocurrencies are back. And probably this time, they're here to stay. So whether you've been keeping your money in a mattress or a Monzo account, at the very least, it's time to pay attention. After all, why should the left stay attached to a money system that the state controls? And since the last boom, crypto has changed quite a bit. Although the most famous cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, still runs on the energy-intensive mechanism called proof of work, Ethereum and many other blockchain-based systems have shifted to what is called proof of stake, and have stopped guzzling so much power, directly in response to climate change concerns. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of nonsense still around. Meme coins that shoot for the moon and crash almost immediately abound, seemingly more than ever. But they're far from the main thing happening. Sam Hart is a developer in the space, and an editor of Crypto Economic Systems, a peer-reviewed journal that studies how to improve blockchain technologies far and wide. My name is Richard James, and on this episode of Novara FM, I spoke to Sam about whether crypto can help us implement a new kind of money system, less dominated by BlackRock and the Federal Reserve, and the one that allows for new forms of collective action, a focus on local economies, and the emerging possibilities of an internet where you don't have to ask for permission. Sam Hart, welcome to Novara FM.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
We are recording exactly a week before Christmas, on the 18th of December. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump has very recently re-announced the promise that he made before, which is that there will be, in his second term, a strategic reserve of Bitcoin. Now, strategic reserve, for people who are not familiar with the concept, is basically a massive store of something. So the Americans have the largest petroleum reserve in the world, basically oil, and they can release that at certain times when there is a lack of that particular commodity in the market, and they can release it in order to bring down the price. That's roughly what is proposed by a Bitcoin strategic reserve as well. Does that surprise you? Does that hearten you? Is that the kind of thing that you think institutional adoption at a state scale of blockchain technologies should look like?
I'm American, so slightly ashamed of the state of American politics. I have a lot of trouble disambiguating the things that Trump says from the politics and kind of machinery around him. So I think there's a lot of like rhetoric there. I have no idea what kind of commitments are actually real and what aren't, but there are certainly people who are interested in that agenda within his contingent. I think there is some like political maneuvering, and both on a kind of national scale and a geopolitical scale. That maneuvering, to be honest, I think is somewhat distinct from what people are kind of presenting outwardly as the value of the strategic reserve. So, you know, those things might be like stability of the dollar or like competitiveness of the dollar. And I don't know, I think the agenda is more along the lines of like signaling some kind of openness to the crypto industry at large, having a vested interest in the Bitcoin industry specifically, and wanting to see that succeed. It's a little bit murky to me, but I'm surprised and I guess curious at what happens next.
There are two things we're going to pick out there that suggest that sort of wider themes in how people normally talk about blockchains. One is that there's a sort of a technical system here that, although it has its own internal dynamics, its own drives towards certain kinds of futures, is captured by a larger political system. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's sort of in some ways the horror of blockchain, or what blockchain has become, which people like the early innovators, Satoshi Nakamoto and so on, were attempting to avoid. They're attempting to depoliticize money, or to make it, wrestle it from the capacity to be manipulated in this kind of way. Satoshi Nakamoto's problem with manipulation is about the Federal Reserve and setting interest rates and the politicization of money as it comes out of the 2008 crisis. But there's also a sort of a sense that the technical system has been captured by the logic of speculation and the need to produce possibly false claims, right? Which is sort of obviously Trump's modus operandi. And so there's a kind of a sense in which the technical infrastructure and the politics are actually kind of merging in a new kind of way. Let's talk about one of those people in that entourage, which is David Sachs. He's been named sort of AI and crypto czar, and we'll come back to some connections later between AI and crypto later. But tell us who about him. What are his interests?
He represents some kind of like reversal in policy at the very least. Well versed in kind of Silicon Valley investment world. What are his interests specifically? He's certainly put there in order to kind of push those agendas forward. I think that's the most important piece. Is there's just like a symbolic acceptance of those industries as like competitively important for the US.
And why are they competitively important for the US? Like, what does that actually mean?
What does it mean for the Trump administration?
Well, what does it mean for an industry to be competitive for a country? So, like, if they're investing in Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is good for the country, despite this sort of tension, Bitcoin is supposed to be detached from states, and yet it is useful for a state. Like, what does that mean?
One thing I feel personally is that the dollar is weaponized globally, and one of the important levers there is monetary policy, and that's kind of the main instrument of control. Is that because the dollar is so widely distributed, the U.S. can basically do deficit spending in order to finance their agenda, and Bitcoin it is supposed to be some kind of check on that. I mean that rhetoric has been there from day one, as there's an alternative kind of commodity form of money that could be used as a reserve in order to prevent some form of like deficit spending or kind of enforce some regime of like monetary discipline. It's kind of playing out in real time, and I'm interested to see how that works.
Blockchain technologies, Web3, crypto, whatever you want to call it, provokes extraordinarily diametrically opposed reactions, right? You get a very, very, very strongly sort of bimodal distribution. People either love it or they hate it. What's your account of why it is that we get that sort of distribution rather than the much more, I would say, ambivalent, complex, nuanced, kind of like shrugging reaction that I often find when I engage with blockchains?
It's easier to understand why people are so ideologically like pro crypto, because there is like an ideological origin to it. There are values that are espoused by some of the early participants, and because there's like pushback from people who are resistant to the technology. On the other side, I think that decentralization broadly is pushing for some kind of disruption of the norm, and that's going to be uncomfortable for people. There was absolutely this kind of backlash against the proof of work expenditure of energy. I guess one of the reasons that I got into the industry in general is a recognition that money was kind of at the center of power. And my kind of origin story was I was living in New York when Occupy Wall Street happened. At the center of that movement was like uncomfort with the kind of core institutions, primarily financial institutions. I think that a lot of the pushback against cryptocurrency is kind of a first order. Money is the issue, and we don't want more of those issues. I think it's a little bit of a naive position to take. Money is a kind of like foundational substrate for any contemporary like social relation. I think you need to have more direct ownership over how it functions and like the place that it lives in society.
And it's not obvious why a left that is anti-authoritarian should support the current money system, which is dominated by states.
Totally. It's just taken as a given.
Let's try and see if we can paint some sort of relatively positive vision of this. Where might crypto be in 5 years' time? This is an industry you work in, right? Presumably you have thoughts about where it should go in the long run. Tell us about what those might be.
The current state of crypto right now is that it's kind of running in a whole bunch of different directions. It's highly fragmented. It's pretty challenging to use. So over the next 5 years, it'll just kind of get increasingly interconnected and just a little bit more user friendly. From a kind of technological deployment perspective, 5 years, I think it'll like actually work the way that you expect instead of you just running into potholes everywhere.
The gold standard people use for this is to say that it should be as easy to use and spend crypto as it is to use Instagram, right? That's the sort of the gold standard UI kind of thing. Is that the kind of change you're thinking about?
Yeah, or Venmo, something like that. I mean, ultimately, a lot of this is like financial rails, and there are financial applications that people are familiar with, that they feel comfortable with. And there are little pockets of crypto that have that kind of experience, but more broadly, it's just like hard to connect different ecosystems, and you can do it, but it's just takes a little bit of effort to make that happen. Just kind of zooming out, what does that mean? Things like cross-border payments should get a lot easier. You know, more broadly, the kind of interconnectedness of the payment system should increase. So, I mean, I've experienced this myself. Like, I much prefer sending a crypto transaction when I'm trying to just move money from the US to Germany or vice versa than dealing with the banking system. It's a huge pain in the ass. It takes forever, and there's oftentimes like rollbacks or things like that are just really confusing to deal with.
Are there kinds of social relations that you think might change as we move deeper into this sort of crypto space? So I'm thinking particularly of the other kinds of aspects of cryptocurrency or other kinds of aspects of blockchains, right? So there are, for example, things like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. What kinds of social relations do you hope might sort of emerge from that broader blockchain transformation?
My hope is that this is technology that can be used for lots of different things. And I would really like to see it pull together local resources more effectively. So there are a lot of scenarios where I'm kind of forced to use the kind of apparatus of the government or like financial infrastructure of the government to just do something with my family or my friends, and feels kind of unnecessary. There is the technology now to just kind of coordinate that more effectively. And it's not something that's like focus of the industry, I would say, or it's like a very small subsector, but it's something that like I'm particularly interested in. I have a very like close-knit friend network that like is very happy to kind of help one another. And if there is just kind of the ability to coordinate that way, then that would be great. I mean, even something like Splitwise, you know, you're kind of like looping through the banking system in order to like go on vacation with your friends and pay for a house. You don't necessarily need to do that. You can just kind of like directly interact with one another.
You're referring here to the sort of the squad wealth thesis.
Yeah, there's an article that myself and a couple friends wrote during the pandemic that was widely popular in the crypto industry, and it argues for exactly this, speaking to the power of small groups and their ability to kind of leverage contemporary financial infrastructure or crypto in particular to utilize their pre-existing resources and interact with the kind of broader media landscape and economic landscape.
Let's talk about a much wider scale of possible effects of crypto and importance of crypto, which we've mentioned already, which is this sort of geopolitical scale. What are the salient factors for thinking about how Bitcoin and blockchain more widely intersects with that geopolitical scale? Obviously, one of them is the availability of energy. Mm-hmm. As everyone listening will know, blockchains take a lot of energy, or at least the proof of work blockchains take a lot of energy to run and to secure. What other factors are there? How does that relate to things like chip wars and so on? How do you see the sort of geopolitics of that?
Yeah, Bitcoin is the only substantial proof of work cryptocurrency. So it has it interacts with the kind of physical space in a very different way. The kind of mining industry has a very interesting geography to it. So the mining industry kind of will naturally aggregate towards where there is the cheapest availability of energy. There are some other factors related to the kind of network topology and how the latency of machines that are on the network and how they're able to connect with others. But by and large, you'll see industries kind of aggregating towards cheap energy. And the cheapest forms of energy are either geothermal. So there's a whole bunch in Iceland. There's a whole bunch of hydro energy. That a lot of the Chinese mining that was going on was co-located with their hydro facilities. And then a whole bunch of like coal powered or like natural gas mining, and some of that is in the United States, and some of that, as you mentioned before, the call is in Kazakhstan and some of these kind of unusual regions. It's kind of a double-edged sword there. I mean, it's both kind of like pushing into renewable energy sources and quite dirty energy. The Chinese mining industry has been significantly reduced as a result of their like regulatory policy. So that's caused a shift more into US and some of these other regions.
Which is one of the ways by which it might become significant for the US as an economy, right? Is that increasingly US and basically just Americans, not necessarily even the US states, but just Americans will own a larger share of crypto, and that will give them greater degrees of power in a new economy. If a separate crypto economy does emerge, is that something you will think will happen? Right? Do you think there will be a sense that Bitcoin or one of the other perhaps more usable objects, perhaps Ethereum, perhaps something like Solana, do you think that one of those things will substantially change or replace or modify the way in which we engage with money at a global scale?
It will certainly change the way that some people engage with money. It remains to be seen whether it's going to be widely deployed enough to change how everyday people engage with money. Fiat currency is like extremely useful to people. I mean, it's like very widely distributed and pushed forward by local governments. So the world in which we like pay with Bitcoin seems a little bit far off at this point. But it may change how some of the back end works and how some of wealth storage works. I'm very interested in the kind of local currency direction. If you look at the local currencies that have succeeded more recently, like a lot of them are pegged to fiat currencies. So at least the denomination or the unit of account is a fiat currency because it's something that people are a little bit more readily. It's easier to think about it. And they're more used to it. So it's easier to transition into that.
You think of a stable coin like a USDT or USDC, or you think of something else?
So I've interacted a bunch with the people who run Sardex. It's like the Sardinian local currency. It's one of the most successful local currencies I'm aware of. And that is euro pegged.
What is a stablecoin, first of all?
So a stablecoin is a unit that is pegged to a fiat currency. So there's a couple different ways to create a stablecoin. You can either put a dollar in a bank account, and then the bank can issue a dollar representation that's tokenized. So something like USDC or USDT are dollar stablecoins, fiat-backed dollar stablecoins.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. I think they're good for it.
Sure. Yeah, great.
You can also create a synthetic dollar stablecoin by backing it with something else. And you can do this in an entirely crypto native way. So something like MakerDAO, which is now called Sky, is backed by Ethereum largely. And then Ethereum obviously is price volatile. So it's over collateralized with Ethereum. And they mint a synthetic dollar from that over collateralized position.
Just to re-explain what you've just said in like non-sort of technical financial terms, what's happening there is that they are holding Ethereum. Ethereum might go down in price, so they have more Ethereum than they need. And then because they are holding enough Ethereum, they can say, okay, we can trade this Ethereum that we are holding at any point for real dollars. And then they can, in that way, artificially or synthetically rather, back an asset organized around the dollar, but that is nevertheless backed entirely by Ethereum, which has a dollar price.
Yeah, exactly.
This notion of sort of backing or unbacked currencies is a very interesting one, and I think one that we find perplexing. It has itself a sort of storied history. The key moment people talk about is the end of the gold standard, which comes in 1971. When America decides to depeg the dollar from gold, which had backed it before. There is a sort of nostalgia in the early Bitcoin proponents for that sort of what's called a hard currency, which is a currency backed by a metal. Can you explain that position? Like, why might you want somebody to be able to convert a dollar or any currency into something hard, but in the case of gold, not very useful?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Prior to the like Nixon moving the U.S. off of the gold standard, most currencies were backed by gold, and there's a whole history kind of prior to World War II, or kind of just subsequent to World War II, the U.S. being the kind of conduit for that backing. The main rationale that like gold bugs or some of these early Bitcoiners had was to increase the financial discipline of the monetary system. So if there is no requirement to back your money by a commodity resource, then you can redenominate your currency. So you can say, actually, instead of each dollar being worth, this, 0.0001 grams of gold, it's now worth 0.00005 grams. So I've kind of halved the amount of backing and therefore printed money. You can attribute a lot of the US's kind of imperialist system to their ability to perform deficit spending and, finance their kind of military industrial complex, essentially.
And you think that's particularly increased since 1971?
Yeah. So the US's hold on the financial system certainly like traces back them being the kind of gold store of the post-World War II economy, but breaking the link to the gold backing just allowed them to increase their leverage. And yeah, there's certainly kind of acceleration after that.
Although the dollar after 71 is not backed officially by oil, it's often proposed that actually there is a sort of an oil economy because oil is internationally traded in dollars.
Yes.
And that is enforced by the US, right? And it's enforced by the US military, right? It does prevents other people from doing anything outside that.
Yes.
That in some ways allows there to be this thing people refer to as the petrodollar, which is the way in which the dollar and oil interact. And the reason why you'd want that, of course, is because oil, unlike gold, is useful, right? You can power an economy using oil, which is pretty important. In some ways, it strikes me that there's a sort of shift that crypto is suggesting from being backed by oil to being backed by computation. Is that how you see the sort of a shift there?
The primary market for oil is in dollars, and the U.S. has spent a lot of resources to ensure that oil is denominated in dollars globally. That has, again, kind of centralized the dollar as a conduit for the financial industry. There are people in the cryptocurrency industry who are interested in shifting away from that regime. That's already kind of happening to some extent. So, without crypto, there are other currencies that now have a direct exchange with oil. Oil is still useful more broadly. So the kind of reserve status of oil or its like utility in the market isn't really going away. But breaking up the kind of singular market of having dollars be the entry point into the oil industry seems to be proceeding at this point.
There was talk about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, when it seemed like the sort of geopolitics of lithium might replace the geopolitics of oil, right? So, instead of having internal combustion engines running cars, you would have like lithium batteries running cars, and then lithium would become the new oil, quote unquote, right? And that would lead to all kinds of various effects in the global economy. That would make countries like Bolivia and Chile and Argentina, which have very high levels of lithium, also Australia, which has lots of lithium as well, that would make them sort of much more like, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, right? In a new economy, not with Wahhabism, presumably, but in other ways. Does that new geopolitics, the sort of geopolitical distribution we were talking about earlier, does Kazakhstan become more important? Do you think that that will substantially change the balance of global power if we have a kind of a currency that is backed in some ways by computation?
I think it will likely shift the balance of power. I still don't think that oil is going away. I mean, it's just like used so broadly, but it could become less of this kind of singular source of all human energy. The Bitcoin is this kind of like derivative of surplus energy. It's like kind of how it ends up being used. So when it is more valuable to refine oil or energy into plastic, or when it's more valuable to drive your car somewhere with using that energy, then it'll be used that way. When it's more valuable to mine a Bitcoin for that same unit of energy, then it'll be used in that way. One of the other things that's like important to know about energy is it doesn't travel well. It can't be transmitted over power line. Like you lose energy as it's transmitted, so it like drops off quickly. And so one of the ways that it's transported globally is through oil, which is more kind of energy stable, and that's like one of the reasons that oil is so popular. If there's a shift to renewables, the energy transport ends up looking much different, and the Bitcoin as a derivative of the energy market more broadly ends up maybe being a more interesting. Bitcoin can be kind of manufactured locally, and that's an advantage to to some of these industries that might be like much more fragmented and located in very different regions than the existing oil industry.
There's a single story that I want to sort of tell that I think wraps up a lot of these tendencies into one relatively neat bow. Because Iran gives free energy to its mosques, right? Because it's an Islamic Republic, lots of Bitcoin miners moved their mining rigs, which require lots of energy to make Bitcoin, into mosques, right, in order to benefit from the free energy the Iranian government was handing out. The other sort of dimension of this story is that, of course, Iran is under sanctions, under international sanctions regime. So we were talking earlier about the ease or the difficulty of international payments. For you or I, that's a mild inconvenience. For the balance of global power, the main things that matter there are things like sanctions on Russia, sanctions on China. The ways in which these kinds of payments are artificially restricted by, or restricted indeed, just generally restricted by states, right? Like America, like NATO, which impose sanctions regimes on other countries. One way that Iran has been able to get around sanctions regimes is by burning its surplus oil, which it's not allowed to export under its sanctions regimes, burning that oil in power plants, using those power to make Bitcoin, and then selling the Bitcoin on the international market, right? And that's permissionless.
Yeah, the important thing here is that it's both permissionless to generate the Bitcoin and to transfer it. So converting from this kind of surplus energy to Bitcoin just requires a miner to extract the resource, and then transferring it in order to get fiat in return is also permissionless. So it's helped some people in the region get around sanctions.
This strikes me as the kind of the way in which the balance of international payments really shifts, right, is around sanctions regimes.
Yeah, I mean, the ability to enforce sanctions is certainly reduced in the cryptocurrency world, one in which like cryptocurrency is widely adopted. That is, depending on who you're speaking to, is a good or bad thing. One thing that I can say about today is that like the sanctions are like broadly enforced by a single entity, like that's the United States. So pretty much everyone respects the US's international sanctions. If you think that the US is kind of a good steward of the ability for an entire country to transact, then you might want that regime to persist. And if you don't think that the US is a good steward of that ability, then you would be opposed to the US having having that kind of singular role and more supportive of people's ability to permissionlessly interact with each other and both kind of produce a currency and transact with that currency.
I guess that you are probably more in the permissionless direction.
Yeah, I think I'm more in the permissionless direction, but with the caveat that I understand that it's a double-edged sword. So it has also helped North Korea to interact with the global market more effectively. Sanctions in general, I think, is a very blunt weapon. I don't necessarily agree with the Iranian government's global positioning, but individuals in Iran are the ones who are, most broadly impacted by this. And it's, important to separate out a regime from the people who are, within that regime. And sanctions kind of touches both of those entities.
Yeah, the famous example of that here is, of course, Iraq, right, which we know was a major driving force of starvation in Iraq and the lack of food and malnutrition and so on. And the US knew this while they were carrying out the program, then refused to stop carrying out the program. And they also knew that it wasn't really hurting the elites around Saddam Hussein and his sort of like small coterie against whom the sanctions were actually targeted. I want to go back to something you said a moment ago about energy arbitrage, because of course, we haven't yet touched on it, but one of the most common objections to blockchains in general, the blockchains that run on what's called proof of work algorithms, is that they're incredibly climate destructive. We're looking at an IMF paper, for example, that said in 2027, so just 2 years from now, basically, Bitcoin might consume 1.2% of all global energy. What do you make of the climate objection?
I'm not very concerned about Bitcoin's energy usage, but like the rationale is like pretty nuanced, and it really comes down to what I said earlier, where the site of any Bitcoin generation is going to go to the cheapest energy, and the cheapest energy is always going to be surplus energy. So whenever it is more valuable to use an energy source for something else, it will be used for that reason. And there is a lot of surplus energy that is just kind of burned off because it can't be expended in, you basically generate energy somewhere with some energy source. So either it's oil or gas or hydro or whatever. And then, there's a clock basically, like that energy must be expended. And if it's not, then that's kind of it. The easiest way, the cheapest way to obtain Bitcoin is to just use the surplus energy. It takes a while for the industry to kind of like aggregate towards all of these sources, to these kind of like surplus sources. But I do think that that's kind of the end result is it actually just kind of gets absorbed into what is now kind of burned off as like heat or carbon dioxide generation. Like those things can actually be kind of recaptured in order to pay for mining.
You don't think it incentivizes people to burn more fossil fuels in order to convert it to energy?
The amount of energy spent by humans right now is, astronomical. And so you need to burn through the entire surplus. And then only at that point is it now more valuable to generate more energy in order to mine a Bitcoin than it is to just kind of seek out this cheaper surplus. So it is conceivable that Bitcoin could take over the world, and this is the outcome. But we're quite far from that reality. And if we're in that reality, I feel like our concerns are very different than what they would otherwise be. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about the U.S. not being the global reserve currency anymore, and it's just a very different political landscape that we would live in.
Sure. And I guess to make it very explicit, something we were sort of touching on earlier, while there is a dollar, like a petrodollar, the US has an incentive to maintain an economy that is based on oil. And so if you move away from that kind of economy, one of the major incentives, which is the fact that oil is traded almost exclusively in the dollar, means that that disappears, right? And therefore, one of the major brakes on climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation disappears. There are other ways of doing blockchains, right? One of them is called proof of stake.
Mm-hmm.
This is the operating procedure now of Ethereum, which is the second largest blockchain. And I want to shift our conversation towards thinking about Ethereum and thinking about the sort of the landscape of things that you can do permissionless computation with, rather than just like move numbers around on a ledger, which is how Bitcoin works.
Mm-hmm.
My mental model for Ethereum and for other things like this is it's sort of decentralized or distributed Amazon Web Services. So Amazon Web Services, people might know, is basically where you can run a computer program, but it's not on your machine; it's on the cloud, so to speak. Is that the right mental model? Do you find that compelling as a sort of a way of thinking about Ethereum, thinking about what these non-Bitcoin chains are doing?
It's a helpful metaphor in some conversations. If Ethereum is decentralized Amazon Web Services, it's like the worst like AWS VPS you could possibly imagine. I mean, it's a very slow, very expensive machine to run. So, I mean, a blockchain in general is basically an economically secured computer, and there's hundreds of thousands of machines securing a calculator-sized amount of computation. So that's what Ethereum is. It's a very expensive, very secure machine. Typically, what you want to put on a machine like that are proofs of other computation. That's where you might get your decentralized Amazon Web Services, is by performing a computation elsewhere, generating a proof that you perform that computation, and then submitting that proof to the ledger and having other people be able to verify it.
So you do the computation elsewhere, and then you submit. Is this using ZK Snark? Is that the kind of the state of the art thing? Is there a way of explaining what ZK Snark is to our audience that doesn't require you to explain what a polynomial is as well?
Yeah, ZK Snark, like a succinct zero knowledge proof, is a proof of computation. It allows someone to give a program to an untrusted entity. So this is you could give it to your worst enemy. They can run the computation and generate a proof, give you the result of the computation and the proof, and you can have an assurance that that person ran the computation correctly. So this allows you to delegate computation to an external entity. It's a relatively new kind of field of computation. You don't need to use a zero knowledge proof to do this. You can have a kind of interactive proof system that performs a similar result. But yeah, in general, this is a technique that's used very broadly in crypto in order to do this form of delegation, where I only want to submit a proof, this kind of succinct piece of data, and I can have an assurance that an external party performed this computation correctly. And so this is used for different blockchains interacting with one another. You can prove that the entire blockchain, the external blockchain, did what it says it was going to do. So you can create a secure connection between them. And it's used for scaling to turn a calculator-sized computer into something that has significant execution capabilities with the same level of security.
This is what's called a distinction in the sort of the field between L1 and L2.
Mm-hmm.
So an L1 is the layer 1, which is the sort of settlement layer. It's the layer which that's what Ethereum is doing, where you simply submit the proof and say, this has definitely happened in the way that it said it was going to happen. And then an L2 would be a kind of a different blockchain that interacts with the L1. That's the level 2. And what that would do is actually run the computation on there. Or you might have an L3 or an L4, and you can abstract away a long way away in order to get even faster computation, but still secured all the time to this L1 that guarantees that the right things are happening. This sort of social world that was envisaged when Ethereum was first launched back in 2015, I think it was, there was sort of a sense that the social world of permissionless decentralized apps and people using cryptography as keys to their house, and then only if a smart contract said that they had paid their rent on time to the landlord would they be let into their own house. That's the classic example. Mm-hmm. But a whole sort of landscape of ways in which people would go and check things on the ledger, right? Check things, who owned what. We're 10 years in. That hasn't materialized. Do you think we're simply too early? Or is there a sense in which that isn't the right sort of social future for what these kind of things are capable of? And is there an attractive version of that? Because that one sounds pretty hellish. At least the one with the landlord.
I mean, some of this comes down to do I think governments are going away? And I don't think that's the case. There are already like forms of automation that look a little bit like this, so there's these like Amazon lockers or whatever, and it's the same kind of idea. Like you put your phone up to it, or you enter a code, and then like it communicates with Amazon, and then they unlock something, and it's like that exists today. People use these things. It doesn't preclude the government from existing in order to have something like that work. But a lot of the fanciful imaginaries that were around in early crypto were kind of imagining something like this, where it's like you can actually just have property rights of physical resources that don't require the government to be in the loop. I both don't think that the government is going away, and that there will probably be increased forms of automation and leveraging of these kind of external trust machines in order to automate certain aspects of this. Yeah, the key question is like, does it allow for the kind of network state idea to now be like an alternative to existing sovereignty? And I don't know, I have a lot of issues with the kind of formulation of what a network state is and how it operates globally. I think that trend is kind of a long time coming, and don't necessarily agree with like the direction that it's going. But things like increased bureaucratic efficiency certainly reduce the cost of experimenting with some of these things.
I can see that as an American living in Germany, you might find that particularly sort of pressing concern.
Certainly would love to reduce the amount of bureaucracy in my life.
For sure. Let's talk about that vision, because that is the main dominant vision, I think, at the moment in the crypto space for what a fully fledged crypto economics, a crypto sort of political scene could be. And that is what you've called the network state. This is an idea from Balaji Srinivasan. Just tell us what is his vision for what crypto could do.
The network state, if you've read his book, it's not a very good book. But
I quite liked the format of having the entire thing in one sentence and then a paragraph and then a page and then like a whole book. I thought that was quite a neat way of, people should write more books like that, but I agree it's not very well written.
Yeah, I mean, it's just basically a series of tweets that he's strung together into a book. Basically, the idea is it's kind of like the extension of like the seasteading idea. It's like, okay, entrepreneurs could band together and form a state by obtaining land and kind of declaring sovereignty. He kind of promotes this idea of like an archipelago, which is like a distributed state where there's like different regions that are kind of that have some direct relationship to each other. I don't know how possible that is in order to like have some kind of sovereign territory. My general take on this is like, there's no such thing as a network state. Like a network state is a state. Like once you get to a certain level and you're trying to operate in a sovereign way, like on the international stage, you are now just a state. So it's really just entrepreneurs trying to play as politicians. And there are entities that do this already. Like Saudi Arabia is essentially a network state. It's just like really wealthy people who own the entire political apparatus. So I don't really see much of a distinction between some forms of contemporary governance and what Balaji's going after, except that there's like more technological integration. And yeah, a lot of these governmental forms I think are highly questionable.
In what way?
I mean, just extreme wealth disparity. A lot of it just comes down to no treatment of class divide. I don't think like entrepreneurs like should necessarily be running the government.
Is there's a possibility for a sort of squad state, like a squad wealth state? That seems like implausible as well.
Yeah, I'm more interested in like smaller forms of coordination and municipal participation. Maybe some of the functions of the state being less of like an important part of people's life. I just generally see a drive towards like more and more aggregation of state power. There aren't a lot of forces like pushing in the other direction. And there aren't a lot of forces that are like trying to build up like neighborhood level coordination, just strengthening of local communities.
We have the thing, I don't know if you have this in Germany, but there's a website called Nextdoor, right? Which is currently exists as a sort of a sea of paranoid people posting about the errant black men walking through the neighborhood unpermissioned and so on. How does that vision for a local form of coordination, like what is that vision for you?
Yeah, there's Nextdoor in the United States. I don't think it hasn't really worked, and I think there's there's a selection bias where the people who want to use something like that are maybe not the people who are most the best stewards of that resource. What does it look like? I think at the very least it looks like more direct participation and dialogue about how some of these things function. I think there's a lot of separation. People rely on the government for a lot of very abstract functions that they don't really understand how they work or who controls them, and just having a bit more of an awareness and an opinion on how it should function, I think would be net positive. The healthcare system is a maybe good example. In the US, it's extremely broken. People don't really know how it works or why it's broken, but they know that it's expensive, and there are a whole bunch of intermediaries that they have to deal with, or else. Yeah, I think when you're interacting with the healthcare system in the US, you just feel kind of powerless. So is there a way to at least kind of break up that power structure and make it so that the people who are directly impacted by it have some say in how it works, and have there's some legibility to how the system works?
There was a guy quite recently who had a rather more dramatic solution to the question of healthcare in the US, which brings me to something I wanted to sort of ask about, which is one of the forebears of cryptocurrency, which is crypto anarchy. And particularly the set of ideas around people like Timothy May, who invented a thing called the assassination market that was briefly touched on in the previous episode with Stefano Melezzi, talking about WikiLeaks. It also involves Cody Wilson, who 3D printed the first gun, right? And that's the thing I'm referring to, which is that Luigi Mangione used a 3D printed weapon. These are forms of permissionlessness, right? Are they not? Is this in the same kind of general stream of politics as you see crypto, or how do you see the distinctions between the kinds of overall tendencies of the network state, which strike me as aiming towards a certain kind of orderliness and certainly away from criminality? How do you see that interacting with the kind of permissionlessness that someone like Timothy May or Cody Wilson represents?
Yeah, well, I'll preface this by saying that crypto is not one thing or one ideology. There were a set of core ideologies that some of the early crypto anarchist Bitcoiners that they held, but there's a wide variety today, and people sit all over the spectrum. I think you're right in pointing out that these things are kind of in tension with one another. The notion of a crypto anarchist, there is no state, and a network state, which is kind of reformulating existing forms of sovereignty and power. There is the possibility of both of those ideologies to exist in crypto. Is there the possibility of both of those things to coexist in the world? Probably. I don't know that one could create network state of crypto anarchists. I feel like once you kind of go down the path of creating a state, you're now a bureaucrat. I am very interested in the kind of alternative, what does a more anarchist world look like? There are positive and negative inflections to that. I think that's true of any form of power, but yeah, the kind of the negative intonations of crypto anarchy are always going to have things that are intended to provide a check on the aggregation of power. And so those are things like weapons that can be manufactured locally, and the ability for private communications and things like this. I think you have to contend with that reality that in order to retain local power, there needs to be the ability to leverage some kind of physical violence on the local scale. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it is a kind of necessary condition for that kind of local strength.
I'm also interested in the question of what a more anarchist world looks like. But I find the idea that we might live under Balaji Srinivasan's network state somewhat undesirable, right? Like I think that there's a necessary kind of tension inside that idea. I do want to ask about decentralization though, because decentralization feels like a kind of value that lots of people on who listen to this, who think of themselves as part of the left, can sort of get behind as like a notion. But then when faced with actual forms of decentralization, for example, distributed permissionless computing and other things that Ethereum represents, often I think lots of people on the left sort of find themselves a bit squeamish or kind of like pull back from that. Can you give the sort of the case for why computation should be fully permissionless? Like what is the sort of the bull case there? That's probably not the right term there. But what is the sort of the positive vision there?
I think decentralization has become like a kind of taken on a life of its own as a term. Not everybody's going to have the same understanding of how power works in a system or what decentralization means in a certain context. If you boil down some of the like technical properties of decentralization within a cryptocurrency, it looks like something like censorship resistance or permissionlessness. It's the ability to disseminate information and have a system continue to advance and be kind of resistant to external forms of control.
Yeah, like there's a kind of a squeamishness that I think people often feel on the left when they are faced with the real possibility of permissionlessness, even though I would say that actually decentralization, not having to ask for permission from some central authority, are actually values that the left states in the abstract. How do we overcome our sort of squeamishness about what people actually might want to do with the computer they can do anything on?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is just recognizing that you always exist in a space of trade-offs. Like nothing is a perfect solution. And so you have to ask yourself the hard question of like, is it worth it? If you do have kind of confidence in the ability for individuals or groups to coordinate with one another in a way that's like best for themselves and their neighbors and the people that they interact with, then like the emergent properties of decentralized power should be net positive. But there are always going to be counter forces that you're enabling. So I think people are squeamish because they indexing on the negatives, and you need to ask the question like what is the sum of the positives and the negatives, and like are we comfortable with the net outcome? And it's a personal choice, like whether you think that that's net beneficial or not. I happen to kind of trend towards like individuals and small groups, like on the whole, are going to have a positive influence when they're kind of given power, with the understanding that like there are certainly negatives that come out of that, and you need to kind of accept the consequences of the trade-off that you're making. I
guess that there are already existing forms of coordination that are relatively permissionless, or that don't require permission from anything else to happen, and they are things like BlackRock, right, or the US military, indeed, which we've been sort of implicitly talking about for a long time. There are forms of coordination that, when we're thinking about the smaller scale stuff, sure, seem relatively benign, but the lack of a permission structure, if you had BlackRock but on the blockchain, or BlackRock but it didn't even need to refer to national law in order to constrain its acquisitions, isn't that the kind of agent that would dominate in the long run, given that it's the kind of agent that already exists at the sort of the dawn of this decentralization process?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. Like, I think this is the right question. It kind of implies like a value that is like less talked about when discussing decentralization, which is the ability to have kind of free exit and to have the ability to opt out of some kind of emergent aggregated form of power. So like you have to kind of like actively work against those kind of power centers forming. Decentralizing one aspect of society only for another aspect to kind of like now aggregate power, like you're kind of in the same scenario that you were before. And the agenda should really be trying to kind of structurally put yourself in a position where you have free choice.
And what are the technical innovations that mean that right of exit is guaranteed?
So portability is a big emphasis in a lot of the decentralized technology conversations, whether it's cryptocurrency or otherwise. So portability of information, portability of assets, having the ability to transport and kind of exchange into another system. Interoperability is another one. It's something that I work on a lot. In order to kind of move into another system, you need to have the ability to perform this exchange, and that may be converting one currency into another and saying, okay, I want to use not a dollarized system. I want to use something else. I want to use a local currency, or I want to use Bitcoin, or I want to use whatever. So being able to do that efficiently. I think privacy is a important kind of vector. One of the reasons that BlackRock exists is because they have kind of asymmetric information that they can leverage. There are a lot of benefits to BlackRock having like the number of financial touch points and the amount of data and the amount of kind of connectivity that they do. There's just efficiencies that are gained there. If you make it so that there's a kind of a different information structure to the system that you're interacting with, then you can potentially resist some of those forms of aggregation. I don't know that there's one answer to this. This is like a life's work to kind of resist this form of singular network power. Yeah, I mean, that was just kind of off the cuff. There's maybe more there, but
that's great. Speaking of this sort of decentralization, re-centralization values, are you aware of AI 16Z?
Yes, I don't know that much about it, but I can do my best to speak to this.
Okay, so just for our audience, A16Z is a fund set up by Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the main investors in blockchain technologies over the last few years. Mark Andreessen, who runs that fund, is a noted sort of crypto bull. He believes very strongly that this thing is going to, take over the world, or at least that's the investment thesis that his company runs on. AI 16Z is, as the name suggests, an AI agent based on Mark Andreessen, which makes calls in the market using cryptocurrencies. And so we have a permissionless architecture of economic rails, that is the blockchain, that is then being utilized to fund computation being done by things we think of as AIs that are programmed with Mark Andreessen's thoughts, extracted from his Telegram, extracted from his Twitter, extracted from his writings, that are then used to make calls in the market and therefore increase the power of this agent, right? To make investments, and then to sort of further centralize capital using that thesis. Are we looking here at like an entirely automated form of capital?
Yes, but probably not in the way that it's like promoted. I think the reason that an entity like that has resources to work with is largely because the kind of mimetic value of it, because Mark Andreessen made an investment in this thing, because it has developer mindshare. So can you have autonomous agents that make a profit in the market? I think it's possible. This is not the first AI agent that has traded. Hedge funds are AI agents that trade. Contemporary markets are sophisticated algorithms that are built specifically for trading. And there are humans that are in the loop at certain points in order to continue to develop the software and modulate it in different ways. To some extent, we're not talking about like anything novel here. Like the novelty is some of the functions of those agents. This bot is able to kind of extract some additional forms of kind of market sentiment from like scraping Twitter and things like that. People are able to kind of contribute in a way that has more of this kind of open source, like you can join and write additional software for it. That public interface, I think, has changed a little, but I don't see like much of a distinction if you just recognize that the market is already traded by largely algorithms and sophisticated AI agents.
Are there these kind of synthetic agents that combine aspects of AI, cryptocurrencies, perhaps the forms of coordination in DAOs we were talking about earlier, possibly the kind of network scale that we were talking about before? Like, what is the sort of the cyberpunk or like, utopian version of this that it might exist in the near future?
I'm no AI expert, so I have certainly used LLMs and been playing with them a little bit. They're quite powerful, and I think the set of tasks that they're able to do has like opened up significantly recently. What is the interaction between AI and crypto? What positive features does this enable? One of the best outcomes I could possibly imagine is like some form of bureaucratic automation. There are very negative and very positive forms of this, like having a unstoppable bureaucracy that you are forced to interact with is one of like the darkest futures I could possibly imagine. I mean, it sounds a lot like the German government to me, but having access to bureaucratic automation that you can use to navigate and decipher the bureaucracy that you're interacting with, I think can be really enabling for a lot of people. I know it's one of the largest causes of anxiety in my life, where you are kind of interacting with an opaque system that you don't really understand, and you just need a lot of help to kind of navigate that correctly. So I think, and I'm, in a very privileged position for people who like might not speak the language, or there's a lot of like Ukrainian refugees coming into Germany right now and interacting with the German government for the first time, and they don't have resources or the ability to navigate the system. Hiring someone to be a guide there is just infeasible for the number of people that are now trying to, for the first time, interact with this. So like automating that and having the ability to have that resource available, I think is could be very enabling for people.
I get advertised occasionally tools, I think via the FT it is, where you can automate compliance with various pieces of legislation. Mm-hmm. So the AI tool knows what kind of legislation that you are that you need to comply with, and then it just simply writes responses based on your internal documents for what those answers. Mm-hmm. Within 6 months, almost certainly the answers that you fill out in that form will be read by another AI, which will give a sort of thumbs up. And so you have this sort of strange performance of in a mirror world where just two or three or four or five or six AI agents are just like talking to each other, and then everyone else can get on with their own thing. You're probably familiar with the Zizek anecdote. Do you know about this, about the sex toys?
No, please, for the listeners, okay, and for myself.
So Zizek has this position about the real sexual desire is not held by people, but by what he calls the big other, which is a term from Lacanian psychoanalysis. Mm-hmm. And he comes across, I think it's like a fleshlight, a kind of a male sex toy, and there are female sex toys, obviously, and he's like, well, why don't we just sort of plug these two things into each other, right? And then the sort of the diktat that we have sex is fulfilled. And we can just get on with actually having a nice relationship that doesn't require us to go away and express sexual desire. And I feel the same thing might happen with bureaucracy, right? Where you have just like the inner German need to have a bureaucracy is fulfilled by the fact that AI is talking to each other, and then everyone else can get on with kind of living a normal life.
We can only hope.
I do want to come to your work on art. Scarcity. You've written about scarcity as an artistic condition. Mm-hmm. What kind of artworks does that make possible? How does it change the kind of things we value in art? And what is the history of that idea of scarcity?
So I have an unusual art background. My parents are both artists. I grew up in an artist household, and I have worked for a number of years, published an artist magazine, and now do a number of little art projects kind of as a hobby. Very early on in my kind of crypto journey, like wrote about scarcity and art. The existing gallery system, the art world, I think, is kind of built on scarcity, for better or worse. One of the ways that it is leveraged is in order to evoke an emotional reaction. So it creates some kind of like sanctity of an interaction with an art object. If you believe this environment to be special, or the object to be special in some way, and being unique or kind of individualized, invokes that feeling in a lot of people, then you can kind of put you in a space where you are emotionally available to the statement that's being made by that object. One of the things that all cryptocurrencies do is they basically create digital property rights, and so that is a form of economic scarcity. The kind of broad recognition of a kind of canonical chain of property relations gives you, results in things like NFTs, where you can have, okay, this is the ownership claim on this image or specific art object. So that helps to kind of bind an artwork to a person and therefore facilitate that kind of emotional relationship. There are other forms of art beyond this that I'm very interested in, like unlimited edition artworks that specifically kind of break the property relation with art, but ownership can be kind of leveraged as a tool to invoke this reaction. And yeah, many artists are kind of playing with this when it comes to creating artworks with NFTs or artworks that interact with blockchains in some way.
I guess the thing people probably associate more strongly than scarcity is a sort of a speculativeness when thinking about blockchain and artworks. And I wanted to kind of ask about this broad social logic. This is something that Queen Slobodian, who's a social critic, said the other day about the kinds of logic that mainstream cryptocurrencies had instilled in a whole generation of people, whereby the means of social advancement, getting ahead in society, getting out of the sort of the stupidity of spending all your time working in a Walmart or something, right? The means of doing that have become increasingly tied to things that were essentially kind of casino-like, that were sort of speculative. So NFTs is a very good example of that, but other cryptocurrencies as well, shitcoins, altcoins, and so on. We're currently in the middle of a massive boom in the shitcoin. We've had Luigi coin, referencing the shooter earlier. We've had Hawk, and so on. Are these damaging to the overall crypto space? And what do you make of that way in which people understand the process of social advancement now, not as collective neighborhood scale endeavor to produce something like squad wealth, but instead as essentially a slot machine that you play online and that sometimes gives you 100 grand and sometimes gives you nothing at all, or indeed takes your money?
Yeah, I think it is damaging to the overall perception of the industry, no doubt. I mean, the amount of like fraudulent activity at the center of the industry was also, a major black eye. Am I like in a position to pass judgment on people who are speculating on dog coins? I don't know. The industry is kind of like identified, the market has identified that the ability to kind of like monetize attention and the kind of contemporary zeitgeist through the issuance of these mimetically associated coins. I don't know. I'm not much of a gambler, but like it's like something that kind of just has always existed in society, and it seems like this is the kind of digital counterpart. Instead of going to the casino, you hang out on Twitter, and when there's a new like trending theme or something, you like buy into that coin. The thing it says to me is that there's like a deep apathy about contemporary like reality. There's like a participation on a level that is less like invested in the outcome and more just like along for the ride. Like it's a reflection of like the overall nihilism in contemporary society than anything else, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I'm definitely asking for judgment, not the vibe that I'm going for at all. Tell us about some things that you are working on that you think will improve the crypto space, will improve social life, and tell us about some things that you think are exciting projects in the space.
For several years, I've been working in this ecosystem called Cosmos. And it was started by some folks who were actually really interested in local currencies. I've worked a bit with some of the folks who were working on Sardex. And a lot of what I have done is really just low-level infrastructure development of the consensus protocol itself, interoperability, usability of these systems. It's been interesting, like seeing some of them start to get deployed. I'm trying to work much more on privacy these days. One is called Penumbra. It's a private exchange. And the other is called Anoma. Like close with both of the founders and have tried to kind of set them in the right direction to the extent possible. I would definitely recommend folks check those out. You know, it's still pretty early for the privacy infrastructure development story, but I think there's a lot of hope there. And in terms of like what I would like to see enabled by some of these things, I would love to see more experiments in local currencies and more kind of writing about how to apply these things effectively, deploy them effectively. I think there's also a big need for sex workers, for instance, to have a way to interact privately. And there's a lot of like marginalized communities that are like structurally unable to interact with the market. Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to just put my effort into things that are in that vein rather than meme coins.
Yeah. So early stages of kind of Cosmos rolling out. What have you seen?
Cosmos is conceived as a set of chains that interact with each other through a interoperability protocol. So there are some of these chains that serve different functions. So there's like decentralized storage and decentralized compute, hosting and exchange and things like that. So I'm looking forward to point at which we can kind of interact with these things as a whole, deploy your website to a decentralized database and pay with cryptocurrency and have it all kind of like automated rather than having, you know, an Amazon stack for that same thing. Yeah, a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is kind of wiring those things together and making sure that you could create a singular contract that interacted with all those services together and use it to build your own service or host your own service. There's a lot of pipes that need to be kind of fit together to make that work the way that's expected.
And out of that, you can produce sort of very many different modular systems that could do all kinds of different things that people could decide for themselves, right? A sort of a drag and drop, or what's called a money Legos, and to use the metaphor of some people in the space.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much for talking to us today. Where do people find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at HXRTS, and I've also been using Blue Sky a lot more. I recommend people check it out. Same handle, so find me there. Because
it's less permissioned than X at the moment.
Less permissioned, and I think just the people that have kind of flocked to Blue Sky are an interesting cohort. A lot of academics and people who are interested in decentralized technologies. Find me there and say hi.
Thank you.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support or face the consequences.